Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it. So people are using the World Cup and your victory as an example as to why immigration in Europe is a good thing. Is that what you believe?
First of all, as a French political representative, I am pleased with this beautiful victory from France's national team. But I think it would be very unwise to draw quick conclusions about the so-called success of integration in France, because it is actually exactly the opposite. Today, assimilation cannot work anymore because of the nature of immigration, which is both massive and uncontrolled. France and other European nations have been suffering for decades now. I think this reality cannot be hidden by this victory from the French team, and we had a perfect demonstration of this, just as while French people were happily celebrating the victory, a lot of petty criminals, many of whom were from an immigrant background, used this opportunity to riot, pillage, break things in the street. And this is the demonstration that the melting pot the media is trying to tell us about is not a reality, and that there is, in France, hundreds of thousands, maybe more, of individuals who don't like our country, who benefited from France's generosity, a country which welcomed them, gave them papers, sometimes even citizenship, but as soon as they have an opportunity, then immediately they spit out their hatred for France.
You mentioned how many of these people might not be originally from France. What do you think being French means to them?
What is certain is that France did not hesitate to offer its generosity and sometimes French citizenship to a lot of people who were coming from sub-Saharan Africa and the Maghreb. France welcomed them, allowed them to live in our country without ever asking them to prove themselves with concrete acts of love for our nation. In the end, we are today struggling with a very high number of individuals who, in France, don't like our country, despise it, and are not showing any appreciation for what constitutes our identity, our history, our civilization, but even worse, as soon as they can, demonstrate their despise, their hatred, sometimes with extreme violence, of our country. So we will have to ask ourselves about immigration, about our policy, since today the gates are still wide open and many immigrants keep coming legally or illegally to European countries and France. And we obviously have to put an end to it. And we also have to organise the return to their countries of origin of the people who don't like France. If they are here illegally, we have to deport them. If they're here legally, we have no obligation to renew their papers, and then we can ask them to leave. We have to put an end to the logic that asks us to welcome immigration we don't need, which brings a lot of problems, both socially and economically, of course, but also regarding identity and security.
During the recent NATO summit, we saw Donald Trump say that immigration is changing Europe. He also told the British press that the changes happening in London and France are very sad. Would you agree with him?
Yes, I totally share this statement made by President Donald Trump. And what's interesting is that he wished during his campaign, and still does now that he's president, to defend America's interests, notably by preserving the identity and safety of the American people. But this is not an egotistical wish, since he actually suggests to other countries' leaders, especially in Europe, to do the same for their countries and their peoples. What he said at the NATO summit is common sense. He's right. Europe, or rather the EU, has knowingly organised this invasion with the complicity of most European leaders. And today we are facing the consequences of this anarchic immigration. I think it is time to be lucid, to take the necessary measures and to implement them as soon as possible. Donald Trump, during his campaign, underlined the necessity of controlling immigration flows, especially those coming from Mexico. And in the exact same way it is at its south that Europe has to manage immigration and has to take measures that weren't taken until now. The EU has revealed deal to be absolutely ineffective because it didn't protect the external borders of Europe and never had the will to do so, while in the meantime it lowered the national borders inside of the EU. Because of this, our countries are in a weak position against a flooding they cannot handle. And there's an emergency to have strong external borders, but also to get national borders back. And this is the way Matteo Salvini is operating in Italy, same with Viktor Orban in Hungary or the Austrian government. Everywhere in Europe there is a rising voice advocating for the defence of our civilizational values, national identities and security of our nations.
There's been a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism across Europe. We've even started to see European Jews immigrating to Israel. Why is this happening, and is France doing anything to stop it?
I believe the rise in anti-Semitism in France and several other European countries is one of the many catastrophic consequences of both massive immigration and also of radical Islamism gaining ground in our countries. Today, we're witnessing anti-Semitism, sometimes extremely violent, brutal, from these Islamist groups living in our own soil. And very recently in France, we suffered once again from anti-Semitic attacks. I think it is necessary that political and media elites start opening their eyes about this. They often talked about anti-Semitism, pushing the narrative that it was coming from some French right-wingers, baseless accusations, while today there's a very real anti-Semitism, brutal, violent, coming for Islamists living here.
What are your thoughts on Italy's Salvini? Do you think that he has the potential to disintegrate what the EU has been trying to do?
I think Matteo Salvini is without any doubt the first acting interior minister in Western Europe to finally address the immigration issue and to clearly say that it is over, that from now on Italy will not accept uncontrolled immigration anymore. Until a few months ago, ships of illegal migrants that were approaching the European coast were immediately guided toward Italian ports, and then they could freely roam in the Schengen area. Matteo Salvini declared it was over. First, you will not land in Italy anymore, but also the hundreds of thousands of illegals living in Italy will have to go back. It is an act of lucidity and courage. I think he will be followed, and immediately an axis took form between Austria, the German interior minister who distanced himself from Angela Merkel, and Matteo Salvini to defend this vision of a Europe that wants to protect its borders and protect itself from mass immigration. This is a major change, and I believe it could be the starting point of a radical change in Europe, to build a different Europe, because the EU has failed on everything. They failed on immigration since it organised the invasion, they failed on the economy, and it has led to a collective weakness of European nations. The EU shows it's a failure. It's anti-democratic and its political orientations are disastrous. But today, everywhere in Europe, there's a growing wish to build a very different Europe, which would respect nations and people, a Europe of cooperation, of protection, the opposite of this EU dominated by a non-elected technocratic elite, without legitimacy, who wants to decide on behalf of our peoples what has to be done.
What are your party's thoughts on how Emmanuel Macron has been addressing this issue?
National Rally believes that Macron is trying to protect the old world, a crumbling vision of the EU. He wants to go further with federalism, further with immigration, further with unfair trade, exactly the opposite of what people are asking for. During the latest episodes of the migrant crisis, there was on the one side Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel promoting the arrival of migrants and their asylum applications on the European soil. And facing them were many European leaders saying, "We are done. We now want to protect the external borders." Emmanuel Macron pretends to represent a new generation of politician. He pretends to represent a new world. But what he actually represents is the old political class, which for years has been promoting globalism, immigration, which is at fault for the rise of Islamism in our country, which has never protected the French economy, and has obviously failed on these essential missions. Hence why it is more and more rejected in France and across Europe. I think that at least Emmanuel Macron is clear. He promotes European federalism, which is a European integration to the EU. He promotes the opening of borders, physical and commercial ones, and he helped to clarify things because we're the only ones to have a clear stance, opposed to his, as we want nations back to the centre of the political debate to efficiently protect our people and other European nations.
Macron, he was an investment banker, then he became the Socialist Party economy minister, and then he rose to power and became the president of leader of a brand new political party. And he had the support of pretty much every single media outlet in France. Who do you think backs him or was backing him? And then also, what do you think he actually believes in?
I think he believes in the ideology of absolute free trade and the destruction of nation states, and he embodies this. He realised the perfect blend of the French left and right. He did not really create a new party. He got together most of what previously constituted the centre-left and the centre-right, which were agreement about the most important issues these last decades and had the exact same policies. There's nothing new about Macron. While he was the minister in charge of the economy for François Hollande, 400,000 people lost their jobs. That shows he does not have any new magic recipe to fix France's economic problems. And now that he's president, our economy has only gone downhill for an obvious reason. He has not implemented any useful measures. The French economy is not protected. There's no tariffs like the one Donald Trump implemented recently, according to America's interests. We're not doing anything like this in France or in Europe, which is very detrimental to us, while keeping very high tax rates. Macron promised to lower tax rates, but actually rose them. In France, we have a massive public debt, high tax rates, high and steadily rising unemployment, no protectionism. All of this is ruining our country. Our industry is already very weak because of the international free trade logic which we've been suffering from for decades. And today it is our agriculture that is threatened, particularly because of the free trade agreements like the CETA with Canada or with Mercosur countries.
So right now the EU and the US have been going back and forth over trade deals, particularly in regards to aluminum and steel. What's your take on this?
I think the decision taken by Donald Trump to put tariffs on certain metallic goods, steel and aluminium, falls in line with America's interests. In Europe, it is quite interesting because we saw the EU institutions addressing a moralistic judgment on this decision, while it should rather acknowledge it and take similar measures to protect our goods. Instead, the EU implemented tariffs as a retaliation on goods we don't produce in Europe, which makes absolutely no sense, as we should protect what we're producing here and respect the US's decision. I think Trump decided this especially because of China, so that wasn't an aggression directed at European nations. But I think it shows a resurgence of nations, on the economic sense included, as the free trade logic of a perfect auto-regulating free market is totally falling apart, and today's successful economic models are nations able to defend their vital interests by being active in their economic matters. That is a state which is assuming its mission on safeguarding a nation's economy, and I believe once again we can find inspiration in what's happening in the US, because we should not hesitate when necessary to establish tariffs and protections to defend our economy, the French or European nations.
Does the National Rally want Brexit to succeed? And what are your thoughts on Prime Minister Theresa May's handling of everything Brexit?
National Rally first and foremost wants the democratic choice of the British people to be respected. Nothing is more infuriating than seeing the EU institutions refusing to acknowledge the voters' choice. We have to respect the Brits' choice. They chose to leave the EU and had good reasons to do so. We need to accept it and manage to keep a friendly relationship. I think Theresa May did her best during this period of transition, organised bilateral trade agreements with many countries to prepare for the post-Brexit era, and that's a responsible attitude. It is very shocking to see some EU officials trying to deter other countries from choosing the same path, organising a very difficult and painful exit for the British people. I think they will fail because the UK situation is not bad. They recovered or are recovering the upper hand on their own destiny. And that could be an inspiration, I think, for how we want to rebuild Europe in the future. A Europe built on free nations, establishing close partnerships based on willingness, rather than a broken integrated system with 28 countries.
So for sort of the last geopolitical question, I wanted to ask about Russia. We just saw Donald Trump have his meeting, this summit with Putin in Helsinki. He's had a lot of criticism for his approach with Russia, his approach with Putin. Many do not like how Trump has handled this. What are your thoughts on this? Do you like Trump's approach with Russia, or do you think that there should be a different way?
We ourselves in the National Rally expressed several differences with Donald Trump regarding foreign policy. For instance, the military strikes in Syria. But regarding Russia, I think his approach is both pragmatic and reasonable. On one hand, he wants to protect America's interests. On the other hand, he wants to talk with Russia, and I think this is going along with a worldwide tendency. The will of nations to be heard, to be respected on a sane basis, without having to bow to anyone for a dialogue even with great powers they may be competing against. And I believe here too the EU could get inspired, because the EU submitted to interests which wasn't theirs, adopted a Cold War-like stance regarding Russia, which is senseless, because we share a continent, because we share economic interests, so we have to put an end to this model. We have to go beyond that moralistic posturing which consists in distributing good or bad points to other leaders. We need to be pragmatic. We obviously have important differences in France or in Europe with Russia, but that should not prevent us from respecting this country, from talking with its officials. And I think Donald Trump's example, whether it be with Russia or, although it's slightly different, with North Korea, is interesting because there's a will to toughly defend national interests, yet it does not prevent a real dialogue. Maybe it is actually the opposite.
So I want to switch gears and I want to ask you about your recent meeting with Mark Zuckerberg in Brussels. What can you tell me about that? What were some of the questions that you had and some of the concerns that prompted you guys to have this meeting?
Within the framework of a conference of presidents in the European Parliament, I had the opportunity with my fellow presidents of political groups to question Mark Zuckerberg about several topics, especially about two which seem absolutely fundamental to me. First, the respect of users' privacy by Facebook and its satellites, and then the issue of freedom of speech. Truly a major concern, as it is severely threatened by Facebook. We can see that arbitrarily, without any control neither from the law or parliament, unilaterally, some opinions are simply getting deleted from Facebook. We can see that this is a seed for totalitarianism, for censorship, which absolutely goes against our civilizational values, which actually require that we protect freedom of speech, including of those who have different opinions. We see this worrying trend on Facebook, pretending to chase fake news, but actually chasing all transgressive opinions, all opinions not going along with the political correctness. We saw very clearly in France the fan pages of an association which defends identity, which refuses invasion. All their pages have been censored unilaterally, brutally, and that is very worrying. We had the opportunity of asking Mark Zuckerberg about these issues, and his answers weren't satisfying, to say the least. They were vague, unprecise, and we clearly saw that he refuses to address these issues.
We've seen reports from a variety of different European countries in which citizens are being arrested for hate speech online, whether that be on Facebook or another social media platform. Is this a problem in France as well? And what's your view on your country's hate speech laws?
In France, there are highly restrictive laws attempting to restrict freedom of speech and opinion, to prevent free expression, notably on topics like immigration and Islam, which is to try and prevent the French people and politicians from freely talking about it. It is a very concerning trend. Today, the EU spends its time giving lessons to everyone else about human rights, even those inside the EU who respect the rule of law. The truth is that it is those who defend the model of a globalist and ultra-liberal EU who are trying to shut down different opinions. Today, freedom of speech really is at stake. On the internet, of course, but more broadly, just like individual freedoms which are severely threatened. We can now see how the terrorist threat, which is of course very real, is used to enforce controls on everyone. While to be efficient, we should rather target the communities who represent a danger. In France, for instance, that means some thousands of people who belong to Islamist networks and are an identifiable terrorist threat. The real issue calls for strong policies, but should not be a pretext to restrain the individual freedoms of 66 million French people.